So I've been using Dehancer Pro for just about a little over a month now, and I wanted to share with you guys my workflow when using this program, or rather this editing tool, and see if it helps you guys and gives you an idea for how you can implement it into your own workflow. Just for those uninitiated, Dehancer Pro is a film emulation software that you can get for video editing programs such as Adobe and DaVinci, or even for photo editing such as Lightroom or Capture One. Today I'm going to be using it in Adobe Premiere, but of course this workflow can be applied to any of the other software because the same parameters and sliders that you can adjust exist in both. So without further ado, let's hop into Adobe. Alright, so we're here in Adobe and I already have some footage imported. This was shot on the Canon R6 Mark II in C-Log 3, so that's why it has a very flat look. And I already created proxies so that I can actually work with this a little bit faster. If you'd like me to talk more about proxies, I'll make a separate video, but I'm going to skip that for now. Dehancer technically is an effect that you apply to the footage, so you actually can just select the clip, go to Effects, and when you go down to Video Effects, to Film Emulation, you'll see Dehancer. The thing is, if you do this, you have to go through each clip and add it individually, so like such. So instead, what I like to do is actually add an adjustment layer. So if you go to your project file here, you can right click, you can do new item and select adjustment layer. Now you want to match your sequence settings. In this case, I did shoot in 4K 60 FPS. So I'll leave this as okay. Now we can drag this adjustment layer on top of all our footage. And if you extend it over all the footage, now we can simply drag and drop Dehancer onto this layer. And you'll see that on all the clips, you have the same effect applied. So this is just how I like to get started. Now you'll see that the colors are obviously off. Something's very wrong with the input that we have right now. So we're gonna actually open that Dehancer and adjust some things to make sure it looks accurate. The great thing about Dehancer Pro, I feel, is that it is organized in a logical way so that you actually go through each input in order, you'll get the look that you want. So we'll start with input. So as you see in input, we have source, and it's assuming that I recorded in Rec 709. But I already told you guys I recorded in C-Log 3 with the R6 Mark II. So if we go down here, you'll see we have other options. Instead, I'm going to choose camera. Now on the next menu, we have a camera not selected. We're going to find our camera. In this case, they don't have an R6 Mark II profile yet, but the Mark I is pretty similar. And in fact, I think it looks fine. So I'm gonna go select Canon R6 Log 3 Cinema Gamut, which is what I shot in the Mark II. And now you'll see on our footage that the colors and everything are a lot more accurate and actually looks pretty good already. Under input, you have other parameters to change things such as exposure and even white balance. And I've actually found that this is a little more accurate than actually adjusting it in something like Lumetri Color. So if you adjust exposure here, you can see I can go down a bunch of stops and go up a few stops. You can go to temperature control and change the white balance. And you'll see now we got a cooler or even warmer. And of course you have tint, which is the magenta and green shift. So there's green, there's magenta. And then for defringing, that's actually to help prevent those little aberrations that appear towards the edges of certain subjects, especially when there's like a high contrast situation, such as these rocks. I don't find much of difference here. I can enable it so we can see if there's anything. Honestly, I never really noticed a difference, but feel free to experiment with this on your own. Next up, we actually have the option to choose our film. So this is film emulation at the end of the day. So this is the fun part. So we have a profile here. We have the Kodak Vision 3 250D, which I think D stands for daylight. So this actually looks pretty natural for the setting that I was in, which was outdoors. But obviously you have a ton of other options. Let's play with a few just so you can get a sense of what you have. So you have Fujichrome Provia 100F. That one gives a very magenta-like look right here, at least in this footage. And I think actually looks really cool. Now let's try, we did a Kodak, let's do a Konica X400 Super. Now this is a little more green and a little more contrasty already, I can tell. Definitely gives a different feel here. However, so far, I think I actually really come to enjoy CineStill 50D, but of course this is all personal preference, and as you can see later on, you can actually change the look of these films as well. So under the profile of the film, you actually have the push-pull, which is another, apparently it says EV, which I think is sort of exposure. However, when I adjust it, it seems to do more things to the color. So as you see, -2 adds a little more faded look. Positive adds more like orange look. It's actually very interesting on CineStill. Of course, feel free to play with this. I actually think I do like it a little warmer, so I'm gonna add 0.5 to it and leave it at that. Now, this is where it gets very complicated for me, and I don't adjust too many tools here, but feel free to check out Film Developer here. You have the contrast boost, which, by the way, before you change parameters, you want to make sure that the parameters are enabled, which is usually at the bottom of the drop-down menu. So enabled. Now we'll go contrast boost. You'll see it boost contrast. You can also do it the negative way and reduce contrast, which looks like that. You have gamma correction, which I find doesn't do too much, for me at least, in my eyes. You have color separation, which also doesn't do too much in my eyes. And then color boost, which clearly is more like a saturation meter here, you can tell. Now you have like a black and white look when you're all the way down, which is pretty cool. And it's not purely black and white, as you can still see here in this shot, the blues are still there and the oranges are still there. It's just more like the tones of the colors are like gone, versus boost is like, wow. That looks like definitely a lot of saturation. I might add a little bit for my own taste, maybe like 30. I would probably do closer to 50, let's see. Yeah, because I like seeing some more skin tones, especially like in this shot. Next up, you have the film compression, which once again, I don't really touch because I don't really see a difference in my footage. However, feel free to experiment. If you enable this, I'll show you. I'll adjust some parameters, but I actually do not see a difference. So impact is how strong this effect is. Let's actually add this to max. Maybe we'll see a difference. Now white point, I think it has something to do with the white point, but I never noticed a difference when I slide up or down, as you can see here. Tonal range, not sure again. Slide down, slide up. You can kind of see a difference here. I'm not sure what I would call this, but yeah, as you can see, it's doing something especially towards the white parts of my image. I shall leave that back to neutral. And then color density, let's check it out. Once again, I do not see a difference in my eyes, but feel free to actual pixel peep for yourself if this is something you're interested in. Now these next three, I don't really mess with. Expand is sort of like another way of adjusting the contrast from what I understand. So we'll open it here. It's enabled already. If we adjust the black point, you'll see it sort of moves how dark or bright those black points can get. And then white point, I imagine, does just about the same. But once again, this is another way of doing contrast. Feel free to mess with that. Print, I never quite understood. So you have different profiles here. Linear is what it comes out of. However, you do have some things like Cine and Film Log, makes it a little more flat and log-like. Fujifilm, which looks quite pleasant. Kodak Print also looks very pleasant. And then Kodak Endura Glossy Paper. And we can just check this one out real quick. Very nice. So in this case, I actually do think I like the glossy paper film. And then we can adjust once again, it seems like exposure and contrast values here of what this step actually does. Let's check it out here at targeted white. If I go up, not much seems to change. Exposure, does a little bit of an exposure change. I think I'll leave it back to neutral. Tonal contrast, as you can tell, it actually does a ton of contrast here, especially in certain parts of the image, it seems. Color density, which is probably similar to the saturation that we did earlier. Yeah, just only on certain parts. So it does seem like it's targeting a certain white value, which is why we have the target white here. And then last but not least, you do have saturation, which does what it does, which is black and white here when you have it at 0, which looks really nice actually, I like that. Or back to where it was, which was 100%. Next up for color head, once again, it's more like a white balance coloring thing, as you can tell here. So you got your yellow blues here, you can adjust. Oops, you gotta make sure it's enabled. So I gotta remember to do that first. So enable the effect, you got your yellow blue shift here. Very cool. Magenta green shift. Cyan red. And you get your shadows tone, where you're gonna adjust to only certain colors of the image, your midtones, your highlight tones. And then you have preserve exposure. Let's see what this one does. I guess you would have to apply some effect first before you do that. Then impact is how strong you want this effect to be. Once again, I will disable this because this is not something I use. Now comes the parts which I actually do use a ton, such as film grain. So film grain is that little noisy particles that appear on your image. So we're gonna go here. You can change the size of these. So right now this is 1. You can kind of see some of the specs on this image. So I think the max size you can go here is 2 or 12 actually. And now you can see when I open up this image, the noise is much more prevalent because they are larger in size. I'll leave this at 2. I like a little bit of noise. You can change the amount you have over your image. So we have it at 20. If we increase this, you'll see how noisy the image gets. It's almost like obnoxious at this point. So I would definitely not go at 100 unless you're going for a certain effect. Then you have 0. So you can actually make the image as clean as it was when you got it out of the camera, instead of introducing noise artificially. I'll leave it at 20 because I do like a little bit of this noise effect. Next up, we have film resolution, which is sort of the softening of the image when there's noise present. So if we actually increase this, where there is noise, you'll see that it's sort of a little blurrier. And if you actually decrease this, it'll actually not add any sort of resolution distortion and keep it as sharp as it was in the camera, even though you're introducing that artificial noise. I'll leave that at 50 because I think it looks natural to have some sort of distortion in the noisy areas. Now these next 3 parameters, shadows, midtones, highlights, all refer to how much noise will be present in those areas. Default, these settings look really natural, I think. So having 50 in the shadows, 75 in the midtones, and 50 in the highlights. However, you can adjust this so you can have more or less noise in certain parts of the image, such as more noise in the shadows, less noise in the midtones, and then let's say less noise in the highlights. So now you have an image that looks something like this, where there's actually more noise only in the shadowy parts of the image, not anywhere else. So this is something that you can mess around with. I find that default looks pretty natural and traditional, I guess you could say. Now for chroma, this just refers to the type of noise you're introducing. So you have chroma or lumen noise. Lumen noise is the black and white noise, and chroma is that like red, green, blue noise that sometimes appears in your image. So if you actually bring this all the way down, you'll see here that the noise present is actually only the black and white type. Versus if we actually bring this all the way up to 100, you'll also see in this image that there's also those little red, green, blue particles that pop up in those noisy parts of the image. Maybe another image that would be better for this would be here in the sky. So if we look at the sky here, you can definitely see there's a lot more red, green, blue particle effects from the noise that we introduce. Versus when we bring this down, just for educational purposes, you'll see that those noise particles are just those white specks, not those colored specks. So I prefer not having chroma noise, but of course it is a traditional effect. So you can leave this at 50, which is where it was, or I'm going to leave it at 0, which is where I like it. Then you can change the film type. I'm not certain what this does. Positive sort of removes a lot of noise, it looks like, compared to doing it on the negative. Yeah, it seems to remove a lot of noise, so I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. Then you have your type, which is analog or digital exposure. I find analog looks more natural. I've never seen much of a difference though when I switch it to digital. If anything, it looks cleaner when it's digital, which actually makes a ton of sense when thinking about actually shooting digitally versus shooting analog. So I'll leave it at analog, and I'll leave this at negative to add more noise. So next up we have halation, and that is something that most people are probably familiar with, which is that sort of orange halo that it pops around certain overexposed areas in your image. So it'll definitely be prominent more so in your sky or other light sources. So we're gonna hit enable first. And then what I like to do personally is hit mask mode here so that we can actually see what the effect is doing. So it's only gonna show the parts that are gonna be affected. So that's why right now it is pure black, because there's nothing this is actually being affected to. If I go to source limiter and raise it, not much changes. Versus background gain, not much changes here. We go to smoothness, this actually changes the radius of that sort of halation. And then these two parameters is what I've noticed make the biggest effect, which is local diffusion, which is how much of the image is affected, versus global diffusion, which is actually applied to the whole image. So let me show you exactly what that looks like. If we increase local, you'll see not much really changes, but if we increase global, you'll see that this red tint appears on our image and it's all over the image. So if we actually disable mask mode and keep an eye on where these red blotches are, I'll keep an eye in here. So there's one on the right side we can check. We undo mask mode. You'll see now how much this effect has actually changed our image. So on the right side here, you can see a ton of that sort of orange hue halation, some on my girlfriend's face, and a decent amount on this rocky hillside mountain as well. So I find globals sometimes, it's nice to have, but at 100 it ends up being a little obnoxious. So I would maybe add like closer to 35. And actually, if you see closely, you can see some of this red here where it's overexposed, mostly on the right-hand side here. Now amplify amplifies this effect, very simple. So you can increase that if you want to make it more prominent. So hue actually changes the sort of color that your halation is. So if you bring that down, you'll see that it's a little more red, versus if you bring that up, it's a little more, I would say like orange, maybe even yellow. And then blue compensation, this is to sort of prevent any sort of weird artifacts that may come, because halation, actually, since it is red, it is the opposite of blue. And so if you have it bleeding out of this or into a blue area on your scene, it looks very unnatural, especially if someone's familiar with film. So you can actually combat that here by adjusting this parameter. I don't think I have that issue in this image, so I'll leave that at 0. And then finally, once again, impact is how strong you want this effect to be. Let's put it at 100 so we can really see what's going on here. As you can tell, it's very subtle in this image. It's a little bit on the rocks and a little bit around that tree on the right-hand side. Let's take off the mask mode and check it out. And you can see it's applied around skin tones, towards the tree area, a little bit of the edge here on the ground, which is actually pretty interesting, which makes sense. There's a lot of brightness coming out of there. So it's a cool effect. Feel free to play around with it. We can even check the mask mode on this scene to see what it's doing here. And as you can see, it's actually applying a lot to the tree side here, which is the top right of the image. And then it's very subtle everywhere else. Now, without the mask mode, I would actually drop this quite a bit. I would put maybe impact at 50. Yeah, 50 looks a little more natural. There's just a subtle halation around the trees, and the ground one seems to be gone now. All right, so we're actually almost towards the end here, you guys. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Let's move on to bloom. So first things first, you have to enable this effect. And if you actually notice the image, you'll see that it already applied some sort of blooming, which is that sort of halo, very similar to halation, but except of including an orange tint to that halo, it's more just a white blooming effect around those overexposed areas. It also helps sort of soften the image, which is really helpful when you're doing something like shooting models or something. It's nice to have a little bloom. It's almost like using a Pro Mist filter, but this is emulating that effect. So if we disable this, you can see how the image looks very sharp. I would say take note around the pants here and towards the tree. And then when we hit enabled, you can see how there's a little more blooming white artifacts, and it sort of reaches out into her pants more here. We can actually enable mask mode so you can see what we're doing, just like we did in halation. As you can see, it's very subtle. I almost don't even see it in this image, but we can adjust where these sort of things are happening. So in the highlights, you can increase that. Source limiter, you can adjust that. Details, I never quite figured out what it would do, but you can adjust it here. The amount of diffusion in the image, I like it pretty high. I'll maybe just do 80 this time. Amplify, sort of amplifying this effect. You can choose to save lights, which once again, I have not figured out what that does. And then saturation, which I actually never understood what that did either. It seems like it's fine where it's at. Let's really amplify this effect. Let's take off mask mode. And now you can clearly see all around the sort of blooming effect. Let's go to another image so we can check it out. And it's definitely a little less noticeable here, and it's very subtle here as well. but that is how you apply the bloom effect. Now you have the option to add a vignette. Vignette is sort of the darkening of the edges of a film. You have to hit enable here, and immediately you can see towards the left and right hand side of the image it darkened. If you like, I can disable, you can see it brighten, and if you enable, you can see it darken. Now you can choose how much this is darkening, so you can choose the exposure to really darken, which is like -2 here, and you can clearly see what the vignette's shape looks like. You can choose the size of it. Actually, let's go back to -2 so we can really see the effect here. You choose the size of it. So it's very subtle, only towards the very edges here when you have it at max versus when you have it at very small. It's basically the whole image except for a tiny dot in the center. So that's what the size is referring to. Feather is sort of like how soft that transition from dark to light is. So if we go to 0, you'll see it's basically a straight line, and then you can see where the sort of vignette is happening, which is kind of a cool effect. It gives you that like Warner Bros. Looney Tunes spotlight effect. So you can do that here. Of course, if you have a feather less, you can have it like more like that, and that looks like a sniper scope perhaps. But otherwise, 100 is pretty much where you're most likely going to live. Next, we have aspect ratio, which is the shape of it essentially. So if we actually make the feather as a heart again, you can see when I adjust the aspect ratio, you can make it more oblong like that, or more oblong horizontally. So you just have a way of adjusting the shape here. If we change the center, you can choose where it applies on the image, the position of it, and then center-wise, the position of it on the up and down axis. However, I'm not going to apply a vignette on my images, so I put this at disabled. Next up, we have film breath and gate weave. If you hear meowing, that's my cat out here. She just wants a lot of attention, so I'll make this quick. So film breath is the sort of flickering effect that happens when you're playing film through a projector. So we're going to hit enable, and just to show you what the default parameters look like so you can get an idea, I'm going to hit play here. It is very subtle. It might take a few viewings to actually see what's going on, but we can try to make it a little more impactful here. All right, so period is how often this flickering effect happens. I'm not sure if the number is considered frames, seconds, or whatever, but if we want to really exacerbate it, I would probably bring this to 1. Exposure, I think I would leave at 0. Let's see what happens when it's at 0 and it's at 1. It's so subtle. Let's bring tonal contrast all the way up and then leave impact at 100. Now we'll give it a look. Now you can clearly see how much flickering is actually going on. I probably should put a warning if you have this like epilepsy, you might not want to see this. I don't know if this would trigger it, but oh yeah, that's 100% more strobing here. So what really made that impactful was the tonal contrast, because if I leave that and let's leave exposure at that 1 where it was. Yeah, that's definitely what it is. So it's just the flickering because of the difference in change in contrast is what's really making that flicker very prominent. So if you really want that, you can leave that. Otherwise, I really don't mess with this. Once again, I'm going to disable it. And then last but not least is gate weave. Gate weave is the sort of misplacement of the frames as it's being pulled through the projector. So you've definitely witnessed that, where you're watching a movie on film and it's sort of like jitters left or right, or maybe sometimes up or down. You can adjust that here. That's what translation X is how much it is left and right. Let's say 100. Let's do translation Y 100 to make it really prominent. And then rotate, 100 too. Let's just actually just mess around here. Let's hit enabled. Auto zoom will try to make the frame fit because of all these adjustments we made. And let's make the period 1 so you can really see what's going on here. And we'll start the clip from the top and check it out. And as you can see, it's almost like an earthquake is happening at this point. It is so ridiculous because of how much we've adjusted these parameters. But if you want a more subtle effect, you can just leave it at the default. And I find it has like a very natural, organic look. Yeah, it's so subtle, you barely see it. In fact, my handheld movement probably is more prominent than this actual gate weave. But once again, it's not something I really care about, but it's something you can mess with. So in this case, I'm going to disable it. All right, and that's all the adjustments that you can actually make. False color is more just for adjusting, or not adjusting, but rather perceiving the exposure values in your image. So if we go to false color, we enable it, you'll see the index on your left to show you what's clipping, what's not, what's exposed and what's underexposed, and these are IRE values. And as you can see, my image is pretty much perfectly exposed. If anything, there's a little bit of darkness here that I could have probably brought up especially because the sky is not overexposed yet, so I had some playroom there, but that is fine. Output is the actual amount of the effect you want to apply, so you can put 0, and now you can see it's like basically back to my log format, or you can apply like 80, 90, 50 even. I'll leave it at 100, which is where I like it. And then after all that, if you don't want to have to keep making this exact film effect, you really nail down your values here, you really like how you change the gate weave, the vignette, all of that, you don't want to have to do it again, you can actually export a LUT. The license I have does not allow me to do this, but very simple. You would select, I would probably go to normal, not small. You would hit export LUT, a menu will pop up. In my case, I cannot do it, so ignore this. But then you can save that LUT somewhere on your computer, and then instead of having to go through this whole process again, you simply just apply that LUT onto the adjustment layer and you're done. If you wanted a discount code, I do have an affiliate link in the top of the description down below, which will get you about 10% off. But of course, you can also apply for the free trial so you can mess with these yourself and see if Dehancer is actually right for you. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them down below in the comment section. I'd be happy to answer them and maybe make future videos on them. If you'd like to see a review of Dehancer Pro and not a walkthrough, you can check out my review right here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.